Who's driven the best 3 races into the 2026 F1 season? While it's still pretty early in F1 in 2026, today I want to discuss the results of my F1 expected points model. So to do this, we're going to be discussing the 5 worst drivers and the 5 best drivers. The bottom 5 are going to be ranked based on just number of points below expected, and the top 5 drivers are going to be ranked based on percentages. So for those of you who don't know, my expected points model takes into account driver's starting position, how strong the car is, and also factors like how chaotic the race is. And this also does not include sprint races, but it does take into account mechanical reliability. Best way to do it, normally I prefer percentages, but if you do percentages for bottom 5, it would just be the 4 Aston and the 4 Cadillac drivers and someone else. So that's why just doing it based on the raw difference above or below 0 is generally a bit of a better way to do it. So starting this video with number 5, or the 5th worst ranking to start the season, and that is driver ranked 18th, Arvid Lindblad, 2.9 points below expected, or 58% of the points he was expected to score. And based on historical data, this is in the 28th percentile of data for the last 25-30 years or so. So for Lindblad, I think he's had some okay results. He scored points on his debut in Australia, but there were a couple of races like China, for example, where he had a couple of spins and it was a bit messy. So for that race, not quite as good as expected. Next is Isack Hadjar in 19th. So for Hadjar, negative 3.2 points below expected, or 55% of the points he was expected to score. 26 percentile, so pretty close to Lindblad. For Hadjar, I don't think he's been terrible. He of course broke down that first race of the season, but again, that's not being held against him, but it's more his performances in the second, third races of the season that brings down his score a little bit. Now, number 20 is Oscar Piastri, negative 3.2 points compared to expected. 85% of the points he was expected to score. And you'll notice that his percentile score is much better, 48%. So a little bit below average, but still not great. For Piastri, of course, crashing out on the formation lap, or not even the formation lap, it was the recon lap in Australia, a mistake of his own, is the reason why he's still in the negative. Otherwise, with a very strong performance in Japan, he should be in the positive, and with more races like that in the coming races, he should be able to climb up into the positives pretty quickly. Now, number 21, second worst score so far this year, negative 3.7 for Franco Colapinto, 21% of the points he was expected to score, and also a 13th percentile. For Colapinto, I think he's been a little bit unlucky so far this year. He was on pace to score a good chunk of points, maybe an 8th place finish or a 9th place finish in China, but unfortunately for him, got tagged by Esteban Ocon, and that ruined his race, or didn't ruin his race, but it compromised his race, and he was only able to finish 10th. So his score wouldn't be nearly so bad without that result, but for Colapinto, he has had a hard time so far this year, even with this model taking into account starting position. Still a bit surprising to see him a little bit on the lower side, but it is very, very small sample size. Now, number 22, and so officially the worst driver through 3 races this season, is none other than Esteban Ocon, negative 8.2 or 11%, and based on comparative historical data, it comes out as 5th percentile. So for Ocon, I think it's been a pretty tough start to the season. First race in Australia didn't really go to plan. Second race in China had that coming together with Colapinto, got a penalty because of that. And in a car that looks quite handy in races, it's a car that has been able to score points every race. First 2 races for Behrman, and then the last race for Ocon. And given Ocon's been starting not too far down the grid, he should have scored more points than he has, and that's really reflected in his score. But 11% is well below Ocon's career average, so my expectation is he'll be able to climb his way much closer to the 80 to 90% range. So those are the bottom 5 drivers in terms of just pure score, and now we're going to be looking at the top 5 drivers, but these are going to be ranked based on percentages. That way it does highlight drivers in the midfield a little bit better. Otherwise, it would basically just be drivers at the front of the grid, and it would be impossible for drivers in the midfield to be in the top 5 in most circumstances. So it definitely is a way to kind of highlight drivers who are performing well that maybe don't get the coverage that they normally would. So number 5 is Liam Lawson, positive 1.6, or 124% of the points he was expected to score, and that comes out as 54th percentile. So for Lawson, I think it's been an up and down start this season, but generally pretty good. Of course, the poor start in Australia that he had would have definitely hurt his expected point score, but two pretty decent races in both China and Japan, meaning that he actually recovered all of that deficit that he would have had that first race, and so he's sitting on 1.6. It's a little bit higher than his career average. His career average is usually in like these 70 to 85 point range. But of course, as he becomes more experienced, it makes sense that he would be getting closer to 100. And so for Lawson, if he can be over 100% for the whole season, that would be a pretty solid result for him. All right, number 4 is Pierre Gasly, positive 3.6 or 132% to start the season with a percentile of 60%. For Gasly, I think he's been one of the stars of the season, had very good races in China and Japan. I think a little bit better in Japan than in China, and an okay first race in Australia. So for Gasly, I think he's had a very good start to the season, and these scores, his expected point score reflects that. Number 3, another one of the drivers who I think has been one of the stars of the midfield this year, and that is Oliver Bearman. Positive 6.7, 173%, and that is a 74th percentile. For Bearman, even with that pretty terrible race in Japan, last race that we had, didn't affect his score that much simply because he started so low down the field. He was highly unlikely to score points anyway. But Australia and China, really good results there, and so a really positive score. I think last year his score was about 110%, so even in his rookie season he was scoring above 100% of the points he was expected to, so it wouldn't be a big surprise if he ended up in a similar range or even slightly better this year. So that brings us on to the top 2. Number 2 is actually Max Verstappen, positive 9.6, 493% of the points he was expected to score, and that comes out as 99th percentile. Now for Verstappen, he scored 12 points in Grand Prix this year so far, and I think his expected point score was something around 2. And so that's how you end up with, such a ridiculous number. Of course, first race of the season in Australia, he started 20th on the grid. And in a car that's been not very good, the fact he was able to recover to 6 is pretty impressive. Second race, mechanical DNF, and then third race, was able to get a small haul of points there. So for Verstappen, based on where he's been starting the Grand Prix, he's been doing a lot better than you would expect for an average driver. But because it's Max Verstappen, this is kind of what we would expect. Although the 493% I do think is a little high. Red Bull is still a midfield team for the whole season. My expectation is that for Verstappen, assuming he's locked in and he's giving his best, he could easily get 150 to 200% for the season as a whole. I think the 500% is a little high, but yeah, 150 to 200% is definitely within the realm of possibility. I think for Verstappen, even though the qualifying results haven't been amazing, he did get out-qualified by his teammate in Japan, I believe it was. The race performances have generally been pretty good, even if by his own admission he has at times left a little bit on the table. So that brings us to number 1, and number 1 is Carlos Sainz, positive 1.7, 593%. So for Sainz, of course, he's only scored the 2 points in the Grand Prix, and that was in the Chinese Grand Prix, and given that means that he would be expected to score 0.3 points so far. So of course it's a fraction, it's not a whole number. So it does highlight that, Sainz has had a very, very good start in terms of just pure points haul. And again, 99th percentile. Don't expect it to stay that high for the whole season, but I expect Sainz to have a pretty strong bounce back in this category after having a very poor season last year, where he was basically in the 50 to 70% range for most of the season. I think Sainz, based on what he's been doing so far this season, I would expect that he could easily be in the 100 to 20, 100 to 30, maybe even 140% range, even in a pretty poor Williams car. So that is the bottom 5 in terms of expected points so far in 2026 and the top 5. It's very, very small sample size. Normally I would wait a couple more races before, presenting the results of some of these more advanced stats. But, we have this quite long break, and the expected points results are not terrible. They're a lot better than the ones for the quality and race rating. And so I'm going to have to wait a while to do those. But I thought it would be a good chance to highlight some of the drivers who are performing well and some of the drivers who have been performing not so well so far in F1 in 2026. So that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.